Somewhere beneath the marshes of southwestern Spain, buried under layers of silt and sand and centuries of accumulated silence, lies the remains of a civilization that the ancient Greeks called the richest kingdom in the known world. A kingdom so wealthy that its king was said to have lived for 120 years, blessed by the gods with a reign of unbroken prosperity. A kingdom whose ships sailed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the edge of the Mediterranean, out into the open Atlantic, carrying cargoes of silver, tin, copper, and gold to trading partners across the ancient world. A kingdom whose name appears in the oldest surviving Greek poetry, in the histories of Herodotus, in the geography of Strabo, and, according to some scholars, in the Hebrew Bible itself, where it may be included in the enigmatic references to a distant land of fabulous mineral wealth called Tarshish, a kingdom that flourished for centuries on the banks of the Guadalquivir River, in the fertile lowlands of what is now Andalusia, and then vanished so completely that for more than 2,000 years scholars debated whether it had ever existed at all. Tartessos, the name itself carries the weight of mystery. It refers simultaneously to a city, a kingdom, a river, and a civilization. And the boundaries between these meanings have never been clearly defined because the evidence is so fragmentary and so tantalizing that it has sustained centuries of speculation without ever yielding a definitive answer. No ancient text provides a detailed description of the city of Tartessos. No ancient map marks its precise location. No archaeological excavation has produced a building, a wall, or a foundation that can be identified with certainty as belonging to the city itself. And yet the indirect evidence, the literary references, the archaeological discoveries, the mineral wealth of the region, and the pattern of ancient and trade routes that converge on the lower Guadalquivir, all of this points to the existence of something extraordinary in this corner of the Iberian Peninsula, something that drew the attention of the most powerful civilizations in the Mediterranean world, and then disappeared so thoroughly that its very existence became a matter of scholarly dispute. The scale of the mystery is difficult to overstate. According to the ancient sources, Tartessos was not a minor settlement on the edge of the known world. It was a major center of commerce and metallurgy, a kingdom wealthy enough to attract the attention of Phoenician merchants, Greek colonists, and possibly even Egyptian traders. The Greek poet Stesichorus, writing in the 6th century before the Common Era, described the Tartessian River, the Guadalquivir, as having its sources in silver, a poetic exaggeration that nevertheless captured the fundamental economic reality of a region whose mineral deposits were among the richest in the ancient Mediterranean. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, told the story of a Greek merchant named Kalaios of Samos, who was blown off course during a voyage to Egypt and ended up at Tartessos, where he made a profit so enormous that it became legendary throughout the Greek world. Herodotus also described the Tartessian king Arganthonios, whose name means something like silver man or man of silver, and who was said to have reigned for 80 years and lived for 120, a figure of almost mythical generosity, who offered to fund the construction of city walls for the Greek city of Phocaea out of his seemingly inexhaustible wealth. These accounts suggest a civilization of considerable power and sophistication, a kingdom that controlled access to some of the most valuable mineral resources in the ancient world, and that used that control to build a trading empire of regional, perhaps even international, significance. And yet, despite more than a century of dedicated archaeological investigation, despite the application of modern scientific techniques, from satellite imagery to ground-penetrating radar to chemical analysis of ancient metalwork, the city of Tartessos has never been found. The civilization that the Greeks regarded as one of the wonders of the Western Mediterranean has left behind only fragments, tantalizing hints of a whole that remains stubbornly invisible. Archaeological sites in the Guadalquivir Valley and along the coast of southwestern Spain have produced evidence of a wealthy and technologically sophisticated culture that flourished during the first millennium before the Common Era. But no single site has been identified as the capital, the center, the heart of Tartessian civilization. The kingdom that was once the richest in the West has become one of the most elusive in the history of archaeology. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what we know about Tartessos, what we suspect, and what we may never know. You are going to learn about the extraordinary mineral wealth of the Iberian Southwest and how that wealth drew the Phoenicians across the Mediterranean to establish one of the most ambitious trading networks in the ancient world. You are going to encounter the archaeological evidence that has emerged from sites like El Carambolo, Cancho Ruano, and Casas del Turunuelo, evidence that has forced scholars to fundamentally rethink their assumptions about the sophistication of pre-Roman Iberian civilization. And you are going to confront a question that haunts every civilization that has ever been lost: the question of how a society can be powerful enough to shape the ancient world, and yet fragile enough to vanish from it without leaving a trace that future generations can read with certainty. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The story of Tartessos is not merely an archaeological puzzle. It is a meditation on the nature of historical memory, on the difference between legend and reality, on the ways in which the past can be simultaneously present and absent, known and unknown, documented and invisible. It is a story about what happens when a civilization exists at the boundary between history and myth, when the evidence is rich enough to prove that something was there, but not rich enough to tell us exactly what it was. The Tartessians left no written history of their own that has survived. They left no monumental inscriptions explaining who they were and what they believed. They left behind metal and stone and pottery and the faint outlines of buildings long since collapsed, and they left behind the words of foreign observers, Greeks and Phoenicians and Romans, who described Tartessos from the outside, through the lens of their own cultures and their own interests, never fully understanding the civilization they were describing. And then they left behind silence, a silence that has lasted for more than 25 centuries, and that may never be fully broken. Now, let's begin. To understand Tartessos, we must first understand the land that made it possible, because the story of Tartessos is, at its most fundamental level, a story about geology, about the extraordinary concentration of mineral wealth in the southwestern corner of the Iberian Peninsula that made this region one of the most economically significant territories in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Iberian Peninsula, the great landmass that encompasses modern Spain and Portugal, sits at the western extreme of the Mediterranean basin, a bridge between Europe and Africa, between the enclosed waters of the Mediterranean Sea and the open expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The southwestern quadrant of this peninsula, corresponding roughly to the modern Spanish provinces of Huelva, Seville, and Cadiz, along with portions of the Portuguese Algarve, is one of the most minerally rich regions on Earth. The geological formation, known as the Iberian Pyrite Belt, stretches for roughly 250 kilometers across southern Spain and Portugal, a vast band of volcanic and sedimentary rock containing enormous deposits of copper, tin, lead, zinc, silver, and gold. The Rio Tinto mines in the province of Huelva, which take their name from the river that runs red with iron oxide, dissolved from the surrounding rock, have been exploited for their mineral wealth for at least 5,000 years, and may represent the oldest continuously mined deposits in the world. The scale of ancient mining activity at Rio Tinto is staggering. Roman-era slag heaps at the site have been estimated to contain more than 16 million tons of waste material, testimony to centuries of industrial-scale metal extraction that transformed the landscape and poisoned the waterways of the region. But the mineral wealth of the Iberian Southwest was not merely a Roman discovery. Long before the Romans arrived, long before the Phoenicians sailed west to establish their trading colonies on the Spanish coast, the peoples of southwestern Iberia were extracting copper and tin from the local deposits and working them into bronze tools, weapons, and ornamental objects of considerable sophistication. The archaeological record shows a continuous tradition of metallurgical activity in the region, stretching back to at least the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, with evidence of copper smelting, bronze production, and, crucially, silver extraction using the cupellation technique, a process by which silver is separated from lead ore through controlled heating. The mastery of cupellation was a technologically significant achievement that would have enormous economic consequences, because it meant that the peoples of southwestern Iberia possessed the ability to produce refined silver, one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient Mediterranean, in quantities that no other region in the western Mediterranean could match. The Guadalquivir River, known to the Romans as the Baetis, and to the Greeks by various names including the Tartessos, was the artery that connected the mineral-rich hinterland to the sea. The Guadalquivir is the longest river in Andalusia, rising in the mountains of the Sierra de Cazorla in northeastern Andalusia, and flowing roughly 650 kilometers southwest to the Gulf of Cadiz, where it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. In antiquity, the lower Guadalquivir was navigable for a considerable distance upstream, and the river's estuary was far larger than it is today, forming a broad inland waterway that ancient geographers described as a lake or a gulf, the Lacus Ligostinus, which has since been filled in by centuries of silt deposition to form the modern marshlands of the Doñana region. This estuary provided a natural harbour, a sheltered anchorage where seagoing vessels could transfer their cargoes to riverboats for transport upstream, and where the products of the interior, the metals, the agricultural goods, the raw materials of a rich and fertile hinterland, could be loaded onto ships for export to the wider Mediterranean. It was on the shores of this estuary, according to most scholarly reconstructions, that the city of Tartessos was located, the commercial hub of a kingdom that controlled the most valuable mineral resources in the western Mediterranean. The importance of these mineral resources to the ancient Mediterranean economy can hardly be overstated. In the Bronze Age, the primary metals of civilization were copper and tin, the two components of bronze, the alloy that gave the age its name. Copper was relatively widespread, found in deposits across the Mediterranean and the Near East, but tin was rare. The major tin deposits accessible to the ancient Mediterranean world were located in a handful of widely separated regions: the tin islands of Cornwall in southwestern Britain, the tin deposits of Brittany in northwestern France, the tin mines of the Erzgebirge on the border of modern Germany and the Czech Republic, and the tin deposits of the Iberian Peninsula, particularly in the northwest of the peninsula, in what is now Galicia and northern Portugal, and in the southwest, in the region that would become the territory of Tartessos. Control of tin was control of an essential strategic resource, the ancient equivalent of petroleum, a material without which the dominant technology of the age could not function. The peoples who controlled the tin supply controlled the bronze supply, and the peoples who controlled the bronze supply wielded enormous economic and political leverage. To appreciate the scale of this mineral wealth, consider a simple comparison. The modern nation of Spain is still one of the top mining countries in the European Union, and the deposits of the Iberian Pyrite Belt continue to produce significant quantities of copper, zinc, and other metals. But in antiquity, when the global supply of metals was a fraction of what it is today, when the total output of all the world's mines was measured not in millions of tons but in thousands, the deposits of southwestern Iberia represented a disproportionate share of the available supply. The silver deposits alone were sufficient to make the region the single most important source of silver in the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. The Roman historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, described the astonishment of the Phoenician merchants who first encountered the mineral wealth of Iberia, claiming that they acquired so much silver that they replaced the anchors of their ships with silver ones because their holds were already full. The story is almost certainly exaggerated, but it captures the essential truth that the mineral wealth of southwestern Iberia was so vast that it exceeded the capacity of the early traders to exploit it, and that the profits to be made from the Iberian metal trade were sufficient to justify the enormous expense and risk of maritime voyages spanning the entire length of the Mediterranean. Silver was equally critical to the ancient economy. In the ancient Near East, silver functioned as the primary medium of exchange long before the invention of coinage. Merchants in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in Anatolia, and in the Levantine trading cities of Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, measured wealth in silver, conducted transactions in silver, and accumulated reserves of silver as a store of value. The demand for silver was enormous and constant, and the supply was limited. The silver deposits of the Iberian southwest were among the largest and most accessible in the ancient world, and their exploitation was the economic engine that powered the rise of Tartessos, and that drew the Phoenicians across the entire length of the Mediterranean to establish their westernmost colonies on the coast of southern Spain. The scale of the Phoenician investment in the Iberian trade can be measured in distance. From Tyre, the principal Phoenician city on the coast of modern Lebanon, to Gadir on the Atlantic coast of Spain, is a voyage of more than 3,500 kilometers. In antiquity, this was one of the longest regular trade routes in the Mediterranean world, comparable in distance to the later voyages of the Portuguese and Spanish explorers along the African coast. The Phoenician merchants who made this voyage did so in relatively small wooden sailing vessels, navigating by the stars and by coastal landmarks, stopping at established ports of call along the way, and risking storms, pirates, and the unpredictable currents of the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow passage between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic that the Greeks called the Pillars of Hercules. The fact that the Phoenicians made this voyage regularly over a period of centuries is testimony to the extraordinary profitability of the Iberian metal trade, and to the importance of the Tartessian connection to the Phoenician commercial system as a whole. The cultural transformation that this trade generated was not limited to material goods. The Phoenician presence in the Iberian southwest acted as a catalyst for social change, accelerating the development of social stratification, urbanization, and political complexity among the indigenous peoples of the region. Before the arrival of the Phoenicians, the indigenous cultures of the Guadalquivir Valley were organized at a relatively simple level, with small, dispersed communities engaged primarily in agriculture, pastoralism, and small-scale metallurgy. The Phoenician demand for metals provided the economic stimulus for the development of more complex social structures, including a ruling elite that controlled access to mineral resources and monopolized the trade with foreign merchants. The archaeological evidence for this process is clear in the contrast between the modest burials of the pre-Phoenician period, with their simple grave goods and their egalitarian character, and the increasingly elaborate burials of the 8th and 7th centuries, with their gold jewelry, their imported luxury goods, and their clear evidence of social differentiation between rich and poor, between elite and commoner, between those who controlled the metal trade and those who worked the mines and the fields. The Phoenicians. Their arrival on the Iberian coast in the early first millennium before the Common Era was the event that transformed the indigenous cultures of southwestern Iberia and set the stage for the emergence of what we call Tartessos. The Phoenicians were the great maritime traders of the ancient Mediterranean, a network of city-states clustered along the coast of modern Lebanon, of which Tyre was the most powerful and the most commercially ambitious. The Phoenicians had developed a trading network that spanned the entire Mediterranean, from the Levantine coast to North Africa, from Cyprus and Crete to Sicily and Sardinia, and eventually westward beyond the Pillars of Hercules to the Atlantic coast of Morocco and the Iberian Peninsula. Their primary motivation was commerce, the acquisition of raw materials, particularly metals, that could be transported back to the eastern Mediterranean for sale at enormous profit. The earliest Phoenician presence on the Iberian coast has been dated archaeologically to roughly the 9th century before the Common Era, though some scholars argue for an even earlier date based on literary traditions and scattered finds. The site that provides the most compelling evidence for early Phoenician settlement is the city of Gadir, modern Cadiz, located on a small island at the mouth of the Guadalquivir estuary. According to ancient tradition, Gadir was founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre in approximately 1100 before the Common Era, which would make it one of the oldest Phoenician colonies in the western Mediterranean. The archaeological evidence has not yet confirmed a date quite that early, but excavations in the old city of Cadiz have produced Phoenician material dating to at least the 8th century before the Common Era, establishing Gadir as one of the earliest documented Phoenician settlements west of Carthage. Other Phoenician settlements were established along the southern coast of Spain at sites including Malacca, modern Malaga, Sexy, modern Almuñécar, Abdera, modern Adra, and Toscanos, near the modern town of Torre del Mar. Together, these settlements formed a chain of trading posts that gave the Phoenicians direct access to the mineral wealth of the Iberian interior. The interaction between the Phoenicians and the indigenous peoples of southwestern Iberia was the crucible in which Tartessian civilization was forged. The Phoenicians brought with them advanced technologies, including the potter's wheel, the iron smelting furnace, and sophisticated techniques for metalworking and gem cutting. They brought new agricultural products, including the olive and the grape, which would transform the landscape and the economy of the region. They brought the alphabet, the Phoenician writing system that was the ancestor of virtually every alphabetic script in use today, including the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet, and, through a separate line of transmission, the scripts used to write the indigenous languages of the Iberian Peninsula, including a script that appears to have been used by the Tartessians themselves. And they brought demand, an insatiable appetite for the silver, copper, tin, and gold that the Iberian Southwest produced in such abundance. The result was a transformation of the indigenous culture of southwestern Iberia that was rapid, profound, and, in archaeological terms, highly visible. The sites of the lower Guadalquivir Valley and the adjacent coastal region show a dramatic increase in material wealth, in architectural complexity, in the variety and sophistication of manufactured goods, and in the evidence of long-distance trade contacts during the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, the period that scholars identify as the Florute, the peak, of Tartessian civilization. This transformation was not simply a matter of foreign influence imposed on a passive indigenous population. It was a process of cultural interaction, of selective adoption, and creative adaptation in which the indigenous peoples of the region took what was useful from the Phoenician newcomers and combined it with their own traditions and their own innovations to create something new, something distinctively Tartessian, something that was neither purely Phoenician nor purely indigenous, but a synthesis of both. The most dramatic single discovery that illustrates the wealth of this Tartessian world is the treasure of El Carambolo. In 1958, workers at a pigeon shooting club on the outskirts of Seville, at a site called El Carambolo, accidentally uncovered a cache of gold jewellery of extraordinary richness and craftsmanship. The treasure consisted of 21 pieces of gold, including pectorals, bracelets, plaques, and a necklace, weighing a total of nearly 3 kilograms. The pieces were decorated with intricate geometric patterns and showed a combination of Phoenician and indigenous artistic styles that perfectly exemplified the cultural synthesis of the Tartessian world. The discovery caused a sensation and immediately reignited scholarly interest in Tartessos, which had been the subject of intermittent speculation and investigation since the 19th century, but which had never produced a find of comparable magnificence. The El Carambolo treasure was proof that the legendary wealth of Tartessos was not merely a Greek fantasy. Something real, something tangible, something golden had existed in this corner of Spain, and its discovery raised the question that has driven Tartessian studies ever since. If this much wealth could be found accidentally at a pigeon shooting club, what might lie buried beneath the marshes and fields and towns of the Guadalquivir Valley, still waiting to be discovered? Subsequent excavations at the El Carambolo site revealed not merely a treasure hoard but the remains of a substantial building complex that has been interpreted by its excavators as a sanctuary, a religious site of considerable architectural ambition. The complex included a large oval building with thick walls, a courtyard, and associated structures that showed evidence of repeated rebuilding and expansion over several centuries. The pottery, the animal bones, the ritual objects, and the architectural features of the site suggest a sacred function, a place of worship and ceremony that served the surrounding community over a long period of time. The interpretation of El Carambolo as a sanctuary rather than a palace or a residence has important implications for our understanding of Tartessian society, suggesting that religion and ritual played a central organizing role in Tartessian civic life, a pattern that is consistent with the broader cultural landscape of the ancient Mediterranean. The debate over the character of El Carambolo has not been settled. Some scholars, following the lead of the archaeologists who directed the most recent excavations at the site in the early 2000s, have argued that El Carambolo was not a Tartessian site at all, but a Phoenician sanctuary, a temple built by Phoenician colonists for the worship of Phoenician deities, whose gold treasure represented votive offerings dedicated by Phoenician worshippers. This interpretation, if correct, would significantly alter our understanding of the relationship between Phoenician colonists and indigenous Tartessians, suggesting a greater degree of Phoenician cultural dominance than some scholars have been willing to accept. Other scholars have pushed back against the Phoenician interpretation, arguing that the indigenous and Phoenician elements at El Carambolo are so thoroughly intertwined that separating them is impossible, and that the site is best understood as a product of the cultural synthesis that characterized the Tartessian world as a whole, a place where Phoenician and indigenous traditions coexisted and interacted in ways that cannot be reduced to a simple label of either Phoenician or Tartessian. This debate illuminates a fundamental challenge in the study of cultural interaction in the ancient world, the challenge of distinguishing between the cultural contributions of different groups in a context of sustained and intimate contact. When the Phoenicians and the Tartessians lived side by side for centuries, trading goods and ideas, intermarrying, sharing religious practices and artistic techniques, the result was a cultural landscape in which Phoenician and Tartessian elements were so thoroughly blended that disentangling them is like trying to separate water from wine after they have been mixed in the same cup. The question of whether a particular artifact, a particular building, a particular ritual practice is Phoenician or Tartessian may be the wrong question, because the answer, in many cases, is that it is both, a product of a cultural synthesis that belongs to neither tradition alone. But El Carambolo is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Across southwestern Spain, archaeological sites dating to the first millennium before the Common Era have produced evidence of a culture that was far more sophisticated, far more urbanized, and far more connected to the wider Mediterranean world than previous generations of scholars had imagined. The numbers are revealing. More than 30 sites in the lower Guadalquivir region alone have produced evidence of Tartessian period occupation, ranging from small rural settlements to substantial urban centres with planned street layouts, multi-room domestic structures, evidence of specialized craft production, and imported goods from across the Mediterranean. Phoenician pottery, Egyptian scarabs, Cypriot bronzes, and Greek ceramics have been found at sites throughout the Tartessian zone, testimony to a trade network that connected this remote corner of the Western Mediterranean to the great civilizations of the East. The sheer volume and variety of imported goods found at Tartessian sites demonstrates that this was not a backward region on the periphery of the civilized world, as 19th century European scholars had assumed. It was an active and valued participant in the Mediterranean trading system, a supplier of essential raw materials whose products were in demand from one end of the ancient world to the other. The metallurgical evidence deserves particular attention because it is the metallurgy that explains the economic foundation of Tartessian civilization, and the reason for the intense interest that the Phoenicians and the Greeks took in this remote corner of the Western Mediterranean. Excavations at sites across the Tartessian zone have produced extensive evidence of copper smelting, silver cupellation, ironworking, and bronze casting, indicating a metallurgical industry of considerable scale and sophistication. The site of Tejar la Vieja, a fortified hilltop settlement in the province of Huelva, has produced evidence of silver production on an industrial scale, with slag deposits indicating the processing of thousands of tons of silver-bearing lead ore over several centuries. The site of San Bartolomé de Almonte, near the modern town of Almonte in the Doñana region, has produced evidence of specialized copper smelting operations dating to the Tartessian period. At Huelva itself, the provincial capital, excavations in the historic center of the city have produced Tartessian period material in abundance, including bronze weaponry, Phoenician ceramics, and evidence of metalworking, suggesting that the modern city sits directly on top of a major Tartessian settlement that served as a hub for the metal trade between the mining hinterland and the coastal ports. The identification of Tartessos with the biblical Tarshish remains one of the most debated questions in the field. The Hebrew Bible refers to Tarshish multiple times, consistently associating it with long-distance sea travel, maritime trade, and extraordinary mineral wealth. The Book of Kings describes the ships of Tarshish that sailed on behalf of King Solomon, returning every 3 years laden with gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. The prophet Ezekiel, lamenting the fall of Tyre, lists Tarshish among the trading partners of the Phoenician city, noting that Tarshish supplied silver, iron, tin, and lead. The prophet Jonah, fleeing from the will of God, boards a ship bound for Tarshish, which is described as being in the opposite direction from Nineveh, suggesting a location at the extreme western end of the known world. The linguistic similarity between Tarshish and Tartessos has been noted by scholars since at least the 16th century, and the match between the biblical description of Tarshish as a source of silver, iron, tin, and lead, and the known mineral resources of southwestern Spain is striking. But the identification has never been proven beyond doubt, and some scholars have proposed alternative locations for Tarshish, including Tarsus in southeastern Turkey, Sardinia, or even a generic term for any distant wealthy trading destination. If the identification is correct, then the Tartessian metal trade extended its influence far beyond the Mediterranean, reaching the courts of Israel and Judah through the Phoenician commercial network that connected the two regions. The silver that adorned the Temple of Solomon may have been dug from the same hills that sustained the kingdom of Tartessos. The tin that armed the armies of the ancient Near East may have been extracted by Tartessian miners working the deposits of the Iberian southwest. The economic threads that connected the ancient world were longer and more intricate than most people realize, and Tartessos sat at one end of those threads, providing the raw materials that other civilizations used to build their temples, equip their armies, and conduct their commerce. To appreciate the full scale of the Tartessian world, consider a comparison that brings the numbers into human perspective. If the Tartessian civilization flourished from roughly the 8th to the 5th century before the Common Era, it endured for approximately 300 years. 300 years is a long time. It is roughly the same span as the period from the founding of the first permanent English colonies in North America to the present day. It is roughly the same span as the period from the reign of Louis XIV to the modern French Republic. It is long enough for a dozen generations to live and die, long enough for a distinctive culture to develop and mature, long enough for institutions to be established and traditions to become deeply rooted. And yet, 300 years is also short enough that the end of a civilization lasting that long would have been felt as a catastrophe by the people who lived through it, a rupture with a past that was still close enough to be remembered by the grandparents of those who witnessed its ending. The Tartessians who lived through the decline of their civilization in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era were not separated from the height of Tartessian power by the vast chasms of time that separate us from them. They were separated by a few generations at most by living memory, by the stories of parents and grandparents who could still remember when the silver flowed and the Phoenician ships filled the harbour, and the king's name was spoken with respect from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Then something happened that changed everything. The core problem of Tartessian studies is not a shortage of evidence. It is the nature of the evidence itself, which is simultaneously abundant and elusive, richly suggestive and fundamentally incomplete, pointing clearly toward the existence of a significant civilization, while refusing to resolve the most basic questions about that civilization's identity, its boundaries, its political organization, and its ultimate fate. We know from the literary sources that something called Tartessos existed in southwestern Spain. The Greek references are too numerous, too specific, and too consistent to be dismissed as fiction. Herodotus was a careful historian who distinguished between what he had seen himself, what he had been told by reliable informants, and what he regarded as rumor or legend. His account of Tartessos falls into the second category, information obtained from Greek sources, in a period when Greek contact with the Far West was still active, and the memory of Tartessos was still fresh. The earlier references, in the poetry of Stesichorus and in the now-lost works of other archaic Greek writers, are even closer in time to the period of Tartessos' alleged floret, and cannot be dismissed as late inventions. Something was there. Something real and substantial was there. The Greeks knew about it, traded with it, and wrote about it. But what exactly was it? This is where the archaeology becomes both indispensable and deeply frustrating. The archaeological record of southwestern Spain during the first millennium before the Common Era shows a clear pattern of increasing wealth, increasing complexity, and increasing contact with the Mediterranean world, peaking in the 7th and 6th centuries before the Common Era and then declining sharply in the late 6th and 5th centuries. This pattern is consistent with the literary evidence, which places the height of Tartessian power in the 7th century and its disappearance sometime before the mid-5th century, after which the name Tartessos ceases to appear in the Greek sources. The archaeology confirms that something significant happened in this region during this period. It confirms that the peoples of the Lower Guadalquivir were engaged in large-scale metallurgical production, that they were trading with the Phoenicians, and, to a lesser extent, with the Greeks, that they were building substantial settlements with architectural features that reflect both indigenous traditions and foreign influence, and that they were accumulating wealth on a scale that is consistent with the descriptions in the Greek literary sources. But the archaeology has not produced what scholars most want, a site that can be identified as the city of Tartessos itself. This absence is the central frustration of the field, the gap around which all other questions revolve. Where was the capital? Where was the palace of King Arganthonios? Where were the temples in which the Tartessians worshipped their gods? Where were the workshops in which the famous Tartessian metalwork was produced? Where were the warehouses in which the silver and tin and copper were stockpiled before being loaded onto Phoenician ships for export to the east? The literary sources suggest that these places existed. The archaeological evidence is consistent with their existence. But the places themselves have not been found, and the reason they have not been found is itself a subject of intense debate. The most widely accepted explanation is geological. The lower Guadalquivir Valley has changed dramatically since antiquity. The great estuary that ancient writers described, the Lacus Ligustinus, has been progressively filled by sediment carried downstream by the river, a process that has been accelerated by deforestation, agricultural activity, and, more recently, by industrial mining operations that have increased the sediment load of the river and its tributaries. The result is that the coastline of the region has advanced significantly since antiquity, and areas that were once open water or coastal marshland are now dry land, while areas that were once dry land may now lie beneath meters of accumulated silt and alluvial deposits. If the city of Tartessos was located on the shores of the ancient estuary, as most scholars believe, it may now lie buried beneath the marshlands of the Doñana National Park, or beneath the fields and towns that have grown up on the reclaimed land of the former estuary. Finding a city buried beneath meters of silt in a region of active sedimentation is an archaeological challenge of the first order, one that requires techniques and resources far beyond those available to the scholars who first began searching for Tartessos in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Geological studies of the Doñana region have reconstructed the ancient coastline with considerable precision, and the picture that emerges is of a landscape that bears almost no resemblance to the one that exists today. In the first millennium before the Common Era, the lower Guadalquivir was not a narrow river flowing through marshland. It was a broad, open estuary, a body of water that extended for dozens of kilometers inland. flanked by low hills and connected to the open Atlantic by a wide channel. The estuary would have been navigable by the seagoing vessels of the Phoenician and Greek traders, and its shores would have provided sheltered anchorage, access to fresh water, and proximity to the agricultural hinterland and the mineral-rich uplands of the interior. It was, in short, an ideal location for a major port city, a place where the products of the interior could be exchanged for the goods of the wider Mediterranean in a natural harbour that offered protection from the storms and currents of the open Atlantic. The transformation of this estuary into the modern landscape of marshes and sand dunes was a gradual process that accelerated dramatically during the Roman period, when large-scale deforestation and mining activity in the upper Guadalquivir basin increased the amount of sediment carried downstream by the river. Roman mining operations at Rio Tinto and other sites in the Huelva region generated enormous quantities of waste material, much of which found its way into the rivers and was carried downstream to the estuary, where it settled on the shallow bottom and gradually filled in the open water. By the medieval period, the ancient estuary had been largely converted into marshland, and by the modern period, the marshland had been partially drained for agriculture, leaving the landscape that we see today, a landscape in which the ancient shoreline lies many kilometres inland of the modern coast, buried beneath layers of sediment that effectively conceal whatever structures may lie beneath them. This geological burial is not merely an obstacle to archaeological investigation. It is a form of erasure in its own right, a geological process that has had the same effect on the Tartessian past as the cultural processes of forgetting and overwriting that we have examined in other contexts. The silt that buried the ancient estuary did not discriminate between Tartessian buildings and the natural landscape. It buried everything equally, indiscriminately, and permanently, sealing the Tartessian past beneath a layer of sediment that is effectively impenetrable without expensive and technologically sophisticated excavation techniques. The city of Tartessos, if it existed where most scholars believe it did, is not merely lost. It is buried, hidden beneath the accumulated geological record of 25 centuries of riverine sedimentation, as effectively concealed as if it had been deliberately entombed. If the city of Tartessos was located on the shores of the ancient estuary, as most scholars believe, it may now lie buried beneath the marshlands of the Doñana National Park. The search for the city has a long and sometimes colourful history. In the early 20th century, the German archaeologist Adolf Schulten became convinced that Tartessos lay buried beneath the sand dunes near the mouth of the Guadalquivir, in the area now occupied by the Doñana marshes. Schulten was a scholar of formidable learning and equally formidable stubbornness, a man who had already made his reputation by excavating the Roman siege works at Numantia in northern Spain, and who approached the search for Tartessos with the same single-minded determination. Between 1923 and 1925, Schulten conducted a series of excavations at a site called Cerro del Trigo, near the coast, convinced that he had found the location of the lost city. He was wrong. The excavations produced material from the Roman period, but nothing that could be identified as Tartessian. Schulten spent the rest of his career defending his theories about Tartessos and arguing for the identification of the lost city, with increasing desperation and decreasing scholarly support. His legacy is mixed. He brought Tartessos to the attention of the international scholarly community and assembled the literary and historical evidence with meticulous thoroughness in his monumental work, Tartessos, published in 1922, a book that remains a foundational text in the field despite its many outdated interpretations. But his field methods were poor by modern standards. His interpretations were often driven more by enthusiasm than by evidence, and his obsessive focus on finding the city blinded him to the broader patterns of Tartessian culture that were visible in the archaeological record all around him. The generation of Spanish archaeologists who followed Schulten adopted a very different approach. Rather than chasing a single lost city, scholars like Juan de Mata Carriazo, Antonio Blanco Frejero, and later Juan Maluquer de Motes focused on building a comprehensive picture of the culture and society of the Tartessian zone through systematic excavation of multiple sites. This approach less glamorous than the search for a lost city, but far more productive, gradually assembled the body of evidence on which modern understanding of Tartessos is based. The excavation of El Carambolo in 1958 was a watershed moment, but it was only one of many discoveries that contributed to the emerging picture of a wealthy, sophisticated, and well-connected civilization in the Iberian southwest. Subsequent generations of archaeologists have continued to refine this picture. The work of scholars such as Sebastián Celestino Pérez, Mariano Torres Ortiz, and Ana Margarida Arruda, among many others, has brought new rigor and new theoretical sophistication to the study of Tartessian civilization, applying the methods and the concepts of processual and post-processual archaeology to a body of evidence that earlier generations had approached with methods and assumptions that now seem inadequate. The result has been a transformation in scholarly understanding of Tartessos that is as dramatic in its own way as the cultural transformation that the Phoenician presence once wrought on the indigenous cultures of the Guadalquivir Valley. The old image of Tartessos as a primitive indigenous culture passively receiving the gifts of civilization from their Phoenician benefactors has been replaced by a much more nuanced picture of a dynamic, adaptive, and creative society that selectively adopted foreign innovations, combined them with indigenous traditions, and produced a distinctive cultural synthesis that was more than the sum of its parts. Subsequent generations of archaeologists have adopted a more measured approach. Rather than searching for a single lost city, they have focused on documenting the broader pattern of settlement, production, and trade that characterized the Tartessian zone during the first millennium before the Common Era. This approach has been enormously productive. Excavations at dozens of sites across southwestern Spain have built up a detailed picture of a culture that was complex, wealthy, socially stratified, and deeply engaged with the wider Mediterranean world. The sites range from small rural farmsteads to substantial nucleated settlements covering several hectares. Some show evidence of specialized craft production, particularly metalworking, with furnaces, slag deposits, crucibles, and molds that testify to the industrial-scale processing of copper, tin, lead, and silver. Others show evidence of monumental architecture, including large buildings with stone foundations, plastered walls, and complex floor plans that suggest public or ceremonial functions. Still others are funerary sites, cemeteries where the dead were buried with grave goods that reflect the wealth and the social hierarchy of the Tartessian world. The funerary evidence is particularly revealing. Tartessian burial practices varied across the region and changed over time, but two broad patterns can be identified. In the earlier period, roughly the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, the dominant burial rite in many parts of the Tartessian zone was cremation, with the ashes of the deceased placed in ceramic urns and buried in simple pits, sometimes accompanied by personal ornaments, weapons, or pottery. In some cases, the burials are remarkably wealthy, with gold jewelry, imported Phoenician goods, and fine ceramic vessels accompanying the remains. The grave goods of the richest burials testify to a social elite that had access to luxury goods from across the Mediterranean, and that used those goods to mark and maintain its elevated social status. In the later period, from the 6th century onward, inhumation becomes more common in some areas, and the burial customs show increasing influence from the Iberian cultures to the east and northeast, a pattern that reflects the broader cultural changes that accompanied the decline of Tartessian civilization and the rise of the Iberian world. And it gets worse. The problem of identifying Tartessos is compounded by the fact that we do not know whether Tartessos was a unified political entity at all. The Greek sources refer to Tartessos as though it were a single kingdom ruled by a single king, but Greek writers frequently imposed their own political categories on foreign peoples, describing as kingdom societies that may have been organized along very different lines. Some scholars have argued that Tartessos was not a unified state, but a loose confederation of communities linked by shared language, shared culture, and shared economic interests, rather like the Etruscan city-states of central Italy. Others have suggested that the name Tartessos referred primarily to a geographic region or a trading zone, rather than to a specific political entity, and that the Greeks used the name as a convenient shorthand for the entire complex of peoples and settlements that controlled the metal trade of the Iberian southwest. If this interpretation is correct, then the search for the city of Tartessos may be misconceived from the start, because there may never have been a single city that served as the capital of a centralized Tartessian state. The wealth and the power that the Greeks attributed to Tartessos may have been distributed across a network of settlements and trading posts, none of which was dominant enough to qualify as a capital, in the sense that Athens was the capital of Attica, or Tyre was the capital of the Phoenician city-state of the same name. The Tartessian writing system adds another layer of complexity to the mystery. Inscriptions in what scholars call the Southwestern script, or Tartessian script, have been found at more than 90 sites across southwestern Spain and southern Portugal. The script is a semi-syllabary, a writing system that uses a combination of characters representing individual consonants and characters representing consonant-vowel combinations. The script appears to have been derived, at least in part, from the Phoenician alphabet, adapted to the needs of a language that was not Phoenician and that may not have been related to any other known language. Despite decades of study, the Tartessian inscriptions remain only partially deciphered. The signs can be read in the sense that their phonetic values are largely agreed upon, but the language they represent, the Tartessian language, remains poorly understood. Most of the surviving inscriptions are short, formulaic texts found on stone slabs in funerary contexts, and they appear to follow a consistent pattern that includes personal names, kinship terms, and standard funerary phrases. But the meaning of most individual words remains uncertain, and the grammar of the language has been only partially reconstructed. The Tartessian language itself is the subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Some linguists have argued that it belongs to the Celtic branch of the Indo-European language family, pointing apparent cognates with known Celtic languages and to structural features that are consistent with a Celtic classification. The Irish linguist John Cock published a controversial analysis in 2009, arguing that the Tartessian inscriptions could be interpreted as an early form of Celtic, which would make Tartessian the oldest attested Celtic language, pushing back the documented history of the Celtic language family by several centuries and placing the earliest known Celtic speakers not in Central Europe, as had previously been assumed, but in the far southwest of the continent, at the very edge of the Atlantic. Cock's proposal generated intense debate, with some Celtic specialists finding his arguments compelling and others dismissing them as methodologically flawed, based on too many uncertain readings and too many speculative interpretations of individual words. The debate has not been resolved, and the ongoing discovery of new Tartessian inscriptions, including several significant finds in the early 21st century, has added new data to the discussion without settling it decisively. Other scholars have argued that Tartessian is a pre-Indo-European language, unrelated to the Celtic or any other known language family, a survivor from an earlier linguistic landscape that was largely replaced by Indo-European languages during the Bronze Age. If this interpretation is correct, then Tartessian would join Basque as one of the last traces of the pre-Indo-European languages of Western Europe, a remnant of the linguistic diversity that characterized the continent before the spread of Indo-European speaking peoples. The question of Tartessian linguistic affiliation is not merely an academic curiosity. It has profound implications for our understanding of the population history of Western Europe, for the chronology and geography of Celtic expansion, and for the cultural connections between the peoples of the Atlantic seaboard in the first millennium before the Common Era. If the Tartessians were Celtic, then the Celtic world extended much farther south and much farther west than previously thought, and the Atlantic coast from Scotland to southern Spain was linked by a shared linguistic and cultural heritage that predates the Roman conquest by centuries. If the Tartessians were not Celtic, then the linguistic and cultural landscape of pre-Roman Iberia was even more complex and diverse than we currently imagine, with multiple language families coexisting in a small geographic area, each representing a different strand of the region's deep history. The disappearance of Tartessos is as mysterious as its existence. The Greek literary sources place the last contact between the Greeks and Tartessos in the mid-6th century before the Common Era. Herodotus describes the close relationship between King Arganthonios and the Greek Phocians, noting that Arganthonios offered the Phocians financial assistance and invited them to settle in his territory. But after the fall of Phocia to the Persians in 545 before the Common Era, and the subsequent migration of the Phocians to the Western Mediterranean, the references to Tartessos in the Greek sources become vague and then cease entirely. By the time of the Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, Tartessos was already a memory, a name attached to a river and a region, but no longer to a living civilization. Something had happened between the mid-6th century and the mid-5th century before the Common Era that had ended the Tartessian kingdom, or at least had ended its visibility to the outside world. Strabo himself noted this disappearance with a tone of puzzlement, observing that the river that the earlier writers had called the Tartessos was now called the Baetis, and that the people who had once been called Tartessians were now called Turdetanians, as though the names had changed, but the reality they pointed to had somehow remained. The archaeological evidence tells a parallel story of decline that is consistent with the literary silence, but that raises as many questions as it answers. The sites of the Tartessian zone show a sharp decline in material wealth, in architectural complexity, and in evidence of long-distance trade contacts during the late 6th and early 5th centuries before the Common Era. Settlements are abandoned or reduced in size. Imported goods, which had been common in the 7th century, become increasingly rare. The evidence of large-scale metallurgical activity diminishes. The monumental architecture of the peak period is not replaced or maintained. The elaborate burial customs of the Tartessian elite become simpler and less wealthy, suggesting a contraction of the social hierarchy and a reduction in the surplus wealth available for conspicuous display. Something happened that disrupted the economic and social systems that had sustained Tartessian civilization for 2 centuries, and whatever it was, it happened rapidly and comprehensively. The Huelva horde provides a poignant illustration of the richness that once characterized this region and the abruptness with which it ended. In 1923, dredging operations in the harbour of Huelva brought up from the riverbed a cache of more than 400 bronze objects, including swords, spearheads, bracelets, fibulae, and fragments of shields and helmets, dating to the Late Bronze Age and the Early Iron Age. The hoard was probably a votive deposit, a collection of valuable objects deliberately thrown into the river as an offering to the gods, a practice known from Bronze Age context across Atlantic Europe. The sheer quantity and quality of the Huelva bronzes testified to the wealth of the region and to its connections with the wider Atlantic world, connections that would later evolve into the Tartessian trading network. But the hoard also testified to a world that was passing, a Bronze Age world that was being transformed by the arrival of new technologies, new peoples, and new patterns of trade that would eventually give rise to the civilization of Tartessos, and then, in the fullness of time, sweep it away as well. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The terrifying truth about Tartessos is that the civilization may have been destroyed not once but twice. First in reality by the forces that brought the Tartessian kingdom to an end sometime in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era, and then again in memory by the silence that swallowed its story for more than 2 millennia, leaving behind only the fragments from which modern scholars have been struggling to reconstruct a whole. To understand the depth of this double destruction, we need to examine the various theories that have been proposed to explain the end of Tartessos, and we need to understand why each theory, however compelling in its own terms, ultimately fails to account for the full scope and suddenness of the Tartessian disappearance. The first and most widely discussed theory links the fall of Tartessos to the rise of Carthaginian power in the Western Mediterranean. Carthage, the great Phoenician colony on the coast of modern Tunisia, had grown from a modest settlement founded in the 9th or 8th century before the Common Era into the dominant commercial and military power in the Western Mediterranean by the 6th century. Carthaginian expansion brought it into direct competition with Greek colonial interests, particularly the interests of the Phocaean Greeks, who had established a network of trading posts along the coast of southern France and northeastern Spain. The Battle of Alalia, fought around 535 before the Common Era off the coast of Corsica, was a pivotal moment in this competition. A combined Carthaginian and Etruscan fleet confronted the Phocaean Greeks in a battle that the Greeks technically won, but that cost them so heavily that they abandoned their Corsican colony and retreated to the Italian mainland. The battle demonstrated Carthaginian determination to control the western Mediterranean sea lanes and to exclude Greek competition from the areas that Carthage regarded as its sphere of influence. Some scholars have argued that the fall of Tartessos was a direct consequence of Carthaginian expansion. According to this theory, Carthage, having inherited the Phoenician trading network in the western Mediterranean, moved to consolidate its control over the Iberian mineral trade by eliminating the Tartessian intermediaries who had served as partners and brokers for the earlier Phoenician merchants. The argument draws support from the ancient tradition, reported by several classical authors, that Carthage had destroyed Tartessos, or had at least blockaded its ports to prevent Greek access to the Tartessian metal trade. If Carthage had used military force to seize control of the Tartessian trading network, or had imposed a commercial blockade that severed the connections between Tartessos and its Greek trading partners, the economic foundation of Tartessian civilization would have been undermined, and the kingdom would have lost both its wealth and its reason for existence as a major player in Mediterranean commerce. But here is the problem with this theory. The archaeological evidence does not show the kind of sudden violent destruction that one would expect if Carthage had conquered Tartessos by military force. There are no destruction layers at Tartessian sites that can be dated to the relevant period with confidence. There are no masses of unburied dead, no hastily constructed fortifications, no caches of weapons or military equipment that would indicate a society preparing for or responding to a military assault. The decline of the Tartessian sites appears to have been gradual rather than sudden, a process of progressive impoverishment and depopulation rather than a single catastrophic event. This does not necessarily disprove the Carthaginian theory, because economic strangulation through commercial blockade could produce a gradual decline without a visible military conquest. But it does weaken the strongest version of the theory, the version that imagines Carthaginian armies marching through the Guadalquivir Valley and burning the city of Tartessos to the ground. A second theory focuses on environmental change. The lower Guadalquivir Valley is a dynamic landscape, subject to flooding, sedimentation, and changes in the course of the river and the extent of the estuary. Some scholars have proposed that a major environmental event, a catastrophic flood, a tectonic upheaval, or a tsunami generated by an earthquake in the Atlantic, could have destroyed or severely damaged the city of Tartessos and disrupted the economic systems that sustained it. This theory draws speculative support from a passage in Plato's Timaeus and Critias, in which the philosopher describes the destruction of Atlantis by a catastrophic inundation. Some scholars, beginning with Schulten himself, have suggested that Plato's account of Atlantis may have been influenced, directly or indirectly, by memories of the destruction of Tartessos, transformed and embellished by the passage of time and the conventions of philosophical allegory. The connection between Tartessos and Atlantis is intriguing but unproven, and most mainstream scholars regard it as speculative at best and fanciful at worst. Nevertheless, the environmental theory has genuine merit. The lower Guadalquivir is a floodplain, and catastrophic floods have occurred in the region throughout recorded history. A sufficiently severe flood could have devastated the settlements along the river and the estuary, destroying the agricultural base and the transportation infrastructure on which the Tartessian economy depended. The math is striking when we consider the geological evidence. Studies of sediment cores from the Doñana marshes have revealed evidence of at least one major tsunami event during the first millennium before the Common Era, a wave generated by seismic activity in the Gulf of Cadiz that would have swept across the low-lying coastal areas with devastating force. The precise date of this event is uncertain, but some researchers have placed it in the 6th century before the Common Era, a date that is tantalizingly close to the period when Tartessos disappears from the historical record. If a major tsunami struck the Tartessian coast during this period, it could have destroyed harbour facilities, inundated agricultural land, disrupted trade routes, and killed a significant portion of the coastal population. The economic and demographic consequences of such an event would have been severe, and a society already under pressure from Carthaginian commercial competition might not have recovered. A third theory, and one that has gained increasing scholarly support in recent years, focuses on internal transformation rather than external destruction. According to this view, Tartessos did not fall, it changed. The culture and the political organization of the Tartessian zone underwent a fundamental transformation during the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, driven by the collapse of the Phoenician trading system in the west. The reorientation of commercial networks away from the Atlantic coast and toward the Mediterranean, and the emergence of new social and political structures that replaced the older Tartessian order with something different. The new order was what archaeologists call Turdetanian. After the Turdetani, the people who inhabited the lower Guadalquivir Valley in the period following the disappearance of Tartessos from the literary record. The Turdetani were almost certainly the descendants of the Tartessians, living on the same land, speaking a related or perhaps identical language, and maintaining many of the same cultural traditions. But they organized themselves differently, related to the wider Mediterranean world differently, and did not maintain the same level of centralized political authority or economic integration that had characterized the Tartessian peak. This theory of internal transformation is appealing because it avoids the need to invoke a catastrophic event for which there is no clear archaeological evidence. It also explains the continuity that scholars have observed between the material culture of the Tartessian period and the material culture of the subsequent Turdetanian period, a continuity that would be difficult to account for if the Tartessian population had been destroyed or displaced by an external enemy. The theory suggests that Tartessos did not die, it metamorphosed. The kingdom became something else, something less visible to the outside world, something that no longer attracted the attention of Greek writers, because it no longer controlled the commercial networks that had made it interesting to the Greeks in the first place. But the transformation theory has its own limitations. It does not explain the abruptness of the literary silence. If the Tartessians simply transformed into the Turdetanians, one would expect some record of the transition, some mention in the Greek sources of a change of government, a shift in trading relationships, a new name for a familiar partner. Instead, there is nothing. Tartessos simply vanishes from the written record as though it had never existed, and the Turdetanians appear without any explicit connection to their Tartessian predecessors. The silence is suspicious, and it suggests that something more dramatic than a peaceful internal transformation must have occurred, even if the nature of that something remains unclear. The truth, as in so many cases involving the disappearance of ancient civilizations, may lie not in any single theory, but in the intersection of several. The most plausible reconstruction of the end of Tartessos combines elements from multiple theories, positing a cascade of mutually reinforcing factors that converged during the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era to undermine the economic, social, and political foundations of the Tartessian world. The disruption of the Phoenician trading network following the fall of Tyre, the rise of Carthaginian commercial dominance, and its impact on the patterns of Western Mediterranean trade, the possible occurrence of a major environmental event, such as a tsunami or a catastrophic flood that damaged coastal infrastructure, and the internal social and political tensions that would inevitably accompany a period of economic decline. All of these factors may have operated simultaneously or in rapid succession, each one amplifying the effects of the others in a feedback loop of accelerating crisis. The result was not necessarily a single dramatic moment of collapse, but rather a period of sustained deterioration, during which the institutions, the trade networks, the social hierarchies, and the cultural traditions that had defined the Tartessian world gradually lost their coherence and their capacity to reproduce themselves. This interpretation has the advantage of being consistent with both the literary and the archaeological evidence. The literary silence can be explained by the disruption of the trade contacts that had brought Greek observers into the Tartessian orbit. The archaeological evidence of gradual decline, rather than sudden destruction, is consistent with a prolonged period of crisis rather than a single catastrophic event. And the evidence of deliberate building termination at sites like Cancho Rano and Casas del Toruñuelo can be understood as the ritual expression of a transition that was experienced by its participants as a definitive break with the past, a ceremonial acknowledgement that the old order was ending, and that a new order, however uncertain, was taking its place. A fourth approach to the Tartessian mystery focuses not on the end of the civilization, but on its nature and its connections to the wider world of the ancient Mediterranean. In this framework, Tartessos is best understood not as an isolated phenomenon, but as one expression of a broader pattern of cultural development that affected the entire Western Mediterranean during the first millennium before the Common Era, a pattern driven by the expansion of Phoenician and Greek commercial networks, and the transformative impact of those networks on the indigenous cultures they contacted. Seen in this light, Tartessos was not unique. It was one of several indigenous cultures in the Western Mediterranean that experienced a dramatic increase in wealth, complexity, and external contact during the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, followed by a period of crisis and reorganization in the 6th and 5th centuries. The parallels with other Mediterranean civilizations are instructive. In the Indus Valley, a civilization of remarkable urban sophistication developed in the 3rd millennium, before the Common Era, built cities with standardized brick construction and elaborate drainage systems, developed a writing system that remains undeciphered to this day, and maintained trade connections with Mesopotamia and beyond. The Indus Valley cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were planned with a precision that suggests centralized authority and shared conventions. With straight streets laid out on a grid pattern, houses built to consistent standards, and public facilities, including large bathhouses and granaries that served the community as a whole. The sophistication of the Indus Valley civilization was extraordinary by any standard, and its achievements in urban planning and public sanitation would not be matched in the region for thousands of years. And yet, over a period of roughly 2 centuries, from about 1900 to 1700 before the Common Era, the Indus Valley civilization declined and fragmented, its great cities abandoned, its writing system lost, its urban traditions replaced by smaller, simpler settlements. The causes of the decline remain debated, with scholars pointing to climate change, shifts in river courses, disruption of trade networks, and possible epidemic disease. The writing system of the Indus Valley, like the Tartessian script, remains undeciphered, leaving us unable to read whatever records the Indus Valley people left behind. The parallel with Tartessos is not exact, but the structural similarity is striking. Both civilizations flourished at the intersection of indigenous tradition and long-distance trade, and both declined when the trade networks that had sustained them were disrupted or reoriented. Both left behind material evidence of considerable wealth and sophistication, and both are denied a full voice in the historical narrative because their writing systems cannot be read. At Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, monumental stone structures predating any known civilization demonstrate that human communities were capable of large-scale, organized construction projects far earlier than scholars had previously believed. The site was deliberately buried around 8,000 years before the Common Era, concealed beneath tons of fill, and remained hidden for more than 10,000 years until its excavation in the 1990s. The knowledge and organization capacity that built Göbekli Tepe vanished with its burial, leaving no trace in the cultural memory of the peoples who later inhabited the same region. The parallel with Tartessos is one of concealment. Just as Göbekli Tepe was hidden beneath accumulated earth, the remains of Tartessos may lie hidden beneath accumulated silt, concealed by the same geological processes that have transformed the landscape of the lower Guadalquivir over the past 25 centuries. The ancestral Puebloans of the American Southwest built the great houses of Chaco Canyon, multi-story stone structures containing hundreds of rooms, connected by a network of formal roads extending across the desert landscape. More than 200,000 timber beams were transported from forests more than 70 kilometers distant, a logistical achievement accomplished without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. By the late 1200s of the Common Era, Chaco Canyon was abandoned. The people dispersed. The great houses stood empty. The roads fell into disuse. Within a few generations, the connection between the descendant communities and the builders of the great houses had been lost. The parallel with Tartessos is one of dispersal. The people who built the great houses did not die out. They moved, reorganized, and became something different, something that the archaeological record can trace, but that the participants themselves may not have experienced as a break with the past. At Angkor, the Khmer Empire constructed the largest pre-industrial city on Earth, a metropolis of more than 1,000 square kilometers, supporting a population that may have reached 1 million people. The temple complex of Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever constructed, was built with a sophistication of engineering and a richness of artistic decoration that placed it among the supreme achievements of human civilization. By the 15th century of the Common Era, Angkor was in decline, its elaborate water management systems failing, its population dispersing, its great monuments being reclaimed by the encroaching jungle. When European explorers encountered the ruins in the 19th century, the scale of what they found exceeded all expectation. The parallel with Tartessos is one of environmental vulnerability. Angkor's decline was driven in part by changes in the regional climate and in part by the failure of the infrastructure, particularly the water management systems, that had sustained the city's enormous population. If Tartessos was similarly dependent on the management of the Guadalquivir's waters, for irrigation, for transportation, for flood control, then environmental changes in the river system could have undermined the economic base of the civilization. And then there is Cahokia, near modern St. Louis, the largest settlement in North America north of Mexico, at its peak around 1050 to 1150 of the Common Era. Monk's Mound, the enormous earthen platform at the site's center, rises approximately 30 meters above the surrounding floodplain. The population may have reached 20,000. Trade goods at Cahokia originated from across the eastern half of the continent. By 1300, the site was abandoned. When European settlers arrived centuries later, they attributed the mounds to a mythical race of mound builders, refusing to credit the indigenous peoples of the region with the capacity for such monumental construction. The parallel with Tartessos is one of misattribution and erasure. Just as the builders of Cahokia were denied credit for their achievements by the assumptions of later arrivals, the builders of Tartessos have been denied full recognition by the fragmentary and biased nature of the literary sources that describe them, sources written not by the Tartessians themselves, but by Greek and Phoenician outsiders who understood only a fraction of what they were seeing. The numbers are striking when we tally the archaeological evidence from the Tartessian zone. More than 90 inscriptions in the southwestern script have been found across southwestern Iberia. More than 30 major sites in the lower Guadalquivir region have produced Tartessian period material. The treasure of El Carambolo alone contained nearly 3 kilograms of gold. The Rio Tinto mines produced millions of tons of metal over thousands of years of continuous exploitation. The Phoenician settlement at Gadir may have been established as early as the 9th century before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in Western Europe. The Iberian Pyrite Belt extends for 250 kilometers across southern Spain and Portugal, containing some of the richest copper and tin deposits in Europe. And yet, despite all of this material evidence, despite the literary references, despite a century and a half of archaeological investigation, the city of Tartessos has never been found, and the civilization that bore its name remains one of the most enigmatic in the history of the Mediterranean world. The discovery in 2017 of the site of Casas del Turuñuelo in the province of Badajoz in western Spain, added a dramatic new chapter to the Tartessian mystery. The site, which dates to the 5th century before the Common Era and thus to the final phase of Tartessian civilization, contained the remains of a large two-story building of a type never before found on the Iberian Peninsula. The building was constructed with advanced techniques, including the use of lime mortar and a sophisticated system of drainage channels, and it featured architectural elements that demonstrated a level of engineering skill far beyond what had previously been attributed to the indigenous cultures of Western Iberia. Most dramatically, the site contained evidence of a massive animal sacrifice, with the remains of more than 50 horses and other animals found in a carefully arranged deposit. The horses had been killed and arranged in a deliberate pattern, suggesting a ritual of considerable significance and considerable cost. The quantity of horses sacrificed at Casas del Turuñuelo was unprecedented in the archaeology of the Iberian Peninsula and among the largest animal sacrifices documented anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean. The excavators of Casas del Turuñuelo, led by the Spanish archaeologists Esther Rodríguez González and Sebastián Celestino Pérez, interpreted the site as evidence of a deliberate act of termination, a ritual closing of a building, and perhaps of an era. The building had been intentionally sealed, its contents arranged in a prescribed order, and the entire structure buried beneath a mound of earth, as though the people who used it were deliberately concealing it, preserving it in a state of ritual closure, and marking the end of whatever social or religious function it had served. The parallels with Göbekli Tepe, where an entire monumental complex was deliberately buried thousands of years earlier, are suggestive, though the contexts are very different. What the two sites share is the idea of intentional burial, the deliberate concealment of a sacred space, a practice that raises profound questions about the relationship between the builders and the buildings they chose to hide. The discovery at Casas del Turuñuelo also challenged long-standing assumptions about the level of architectural sophistication in the Tartessian world. The building's two-story construction, its use of lime mortar, and its complex drainage system demonstrated technical capabilities that had previously been associated only with the Phoenician and Greek colonies on the Mediterranean coast, not with the indigenous cultures of the interior. The implication was clear. The peoples of the Tartessian zone were not merely consumers of Phoenician technology. They were innovators in their own right, capable of developing and applying construction techniques that rivaled those of the Eastern Mediterranean. The discovery forced scholars to reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between the indigenous Tartessian culture and the Phoenician colonial presence, a relationship that had often been characterized, explicitly or implicitly, as one of civilized teachers and barbarian students. Casas del Turuñuelo demonstrated that the students were more capable than the teachers had assumed, and that the civilization of Tartessos was more architecturally ambitious, more technologically sophisticated, and more culturally complex than the fragmentary evidence had previously suggested. The religious dimension of Tartessian civilization, glimpsed through the archaeological evidence but never fully understood, adds another layer of depth to the mystery. The ritual deposits at Casas del Turuñuelo, the sanctuary at El Carambolo, the sacred precinct at Cancho Ruano, and numerous other sites with evidence of religious activity all point to a complex system of belief and practice that was central to Tartessian social organization. The presence of Phoenician religious motifs, including images of the goddess Astarte and the god Melkart, at Tartessian sites suggests a degree of religious syncretism, a blending of indigenous and Phoenician religious traditions that mirrors the cultural synthesis visible in other aspects of Tartessian life. But the indigenous component of Tartessian religion remains largely invisible because the literary and epigraphic evidence that would illuminate it has not survived. We can see that the Tartessians built sanctuaries, that they performed animal sacrifices, that they deposited votive offerings, and that they maintained religious institutions that served as centers of communal identity and political authority. But the theology, the mythology, the prayers, the hymns, the stories about the gods and their interactions with human beings, all of this is gone, lost with the perishable materials on which it may have been recorded, and with the living tradition that transmitted it from generation to generation. The sheer scale of the animal sacrifice at Casas del Turuñuelo deserves particular reflection. More than 50 horses were killed and carefully arranged in a single ritual event. In the ancient Mediterranean world, the horse was one of the most valuable domestic animals, essential for transportation, warfare, and agriculture. The sacrifice of more than 50 horses at a single site represents an enormous expenditure of wealth, a deliberate destruction of valuable resources that can only be understood as an act of profound religious or political significance. The closest parallels in the ancient world are found in the royal burials of the Scythians of the Eurasian steppe, where horses were sacrificed in large numbers to accompany their owners into the afterlife, and in certain Near Eastern royal rituals where mass animal sacrifice served to legitimate political authority and to communicate with the divine. The scale of the sacrifice at Casas del Turuñuelo suggests that the Tartessian elites who ordered it possessed both the wealth to afford such an extravagant gesture and the religious or political motivation to carry it out. It also suggests that the event marked a moment of exceptional importance, a transition, a transformation, an ending that required the most dramatic ritual expression the community could muster. Another major excavation that transformed understanding of the Tartessian world was the site of Cancho Rano in the province of Badajoz. Cancho Rano was a large rectangular building complex that has been interpreted as a palace sanctuary, a combined religious and administrative centre that served a surrounding community of farmers, miners, and craftsmen. The building was constructed in the 6th century before the Common Era, rebuilt at least 3 times on the same site, and finally abandoned and deliberately burned in the late 5th century before the Common Era. Like Casas del Turuñuelo, Cancho Rano showed evidence of deliberate termination, a ritual closing and burning of the building that marked the end of its active life. The grave goods and ritual objects found at the site included Greek pottery, Phoenician amphorae, bronze figurines, iron tools, and a rich assemblage of ceramic vessels that testified to the wealth and the cosmopolitan character of the community that used it. Cancho Rano was located far from the coast, in the interior of the Tartessian zone, and its excavation demonstrated that the wealth and cultural sophistication associated with Tartessos were not limited to the coastal areas where Phoenician influence was strongest. The Tartessian interior had its own centres of power, its own institutions, and its own cultural traditions, drawing on Phoenician and Greek models, but adapting them to local needs and local tastes. The architectural plan of Cancho Rano is particularly revealing. The building was organised around a central courtyard, with rooms arranged on all 4 sides in a roughly symmetrical pattern. The central area contained evidence of altar-like structures and ritual deposits, suggesting a religious function, while the surrounding rooms appear to have served storage, administrative, and possibly residential purposes. The combination of sacred and secular functions in a single building complex is consistent with the pattern seen at many ancient Near Eastern palace sanctuaries, where the ruler's political authority was inseparable from his religious role, and where the palace and the temple were not separate institutions, but different aspects of a single integrated system of governance. If Cancho Rano was indeed a palace sanctuary of this type, then the political organization of the Tartessian interior was more sophisticated and more formalized than the archaeological evidence had previously suggested, with established centers of authority that combined political, economic, and religious functions in a manner characteristic of complex, hierarchically organized societies. The pattern of deliberate building termination documented at both Cancho Rano and Casas del Turuñuelo has profound implications for our understanding of the end of Tartessian civilization. If these buildings were deliberately closed and sealed according to a prescribed ritual, then the end of the Tartessian world was not simply a matter of external destruction or passive decline. It involved a conscious decision made by the people themselves to bring a particular era to a close, to seal the past and move on. This is a very different picture from the one suggested by the theories of Carthaginian conquest or environmental catastrophe. It suggests a society that was actively managing its own transformation, that was choosing to end certain practices and certain institutions, not because they had been destroyed by outside forces, but because the conditions that had sustained them had changed and the people who maintained them had decided to adapt. But this interpretation, however compelling, raises its own questions. Why did the Tartessians choose to end these institutions? What had changed in their world that made the old ways no longer viable? Why did they seal their buildings with such elaborate rituals of closure? What did they expect to come next? And what in fact did come next? In the centuries between the end of the Tartessian world and the arrival of the Romans, who would eventually conquer the entire Iberian Peninsula and impose their own cultural and political order on the peoples they found there. These questions have no certain answers, and they may never have certain answers, because the people who could have answered them left no written explanation of their actions. They left only the material evidence, the sealed buildings, the sacrificed horses, the deliberately buried structures, and the silence that surrounds them, like the silt that covers the lost city that has never been found. The deeper truth about Tartessos is that it represents a category of historical phenomenon that is more common and more important than most people realize. The civilization that exists in the space between history and legend, between documented fact and literary embellishment, between what can be proven and what can only be inferred. Tartessos is not the only ancient civilization to occupy this ambiguous space. Troy occupied it for centuries, dismissed as a poetic invention, until Heinrich Schliemann's excavations in the 1870s demonstrated that a real city had existed at the location described by Homer, though the relationship between that city and the Homeric poems remains the subject of endless scholarly debate. The kingdom of Punt, the mysterious trading partner of ancient Egypt described in numerous Egyptian texts and depicted in the famous reliefs at the Temple of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari, occupied this space as well, its precise location still uncertain after more than a century of scholarly investigation. Even the Minoan civilization of Crete, the sophisticated Bronze Age culture that Arthur Evans named after the legendary King Minos, existed in the borderland between myth and history until Evans's excavations at Knossos in the early 20th century revealed the physical remains of a civilization that had previously been known only through Greek legend. Tartessos belongs to this tradition, but with a crucial difference. Troy was found, Knossos was found. The physical remains of the Minoan civilization have been excavated and studied in extraordinary detail, but the city of Tartessos has not been found, and the civilization that the Greeks described under that name remains frustratingly incomplete, documented enough to prove its existence, but not enough to reveal its character with the fullness and precision that archaeology ideally provides. We know that something was there. We know that it was wealthy, that it was culturally sophisticated, that it controlled access to some of the most valuable mineral resources in the ancient Mediterranean, and that it interacted extensively with the Phoenician and Greek worlds. But we do not know its political structure. We do not know its religious beliefs in any detail. We do not know its social organization beyond the broadest outlines. We do not know the names of its rulers. With the single exception of the possibly legendary Arganthonios, we do not know its history, the sequence of events that shaped its development, its triumphs, its crises, and its eventual end. We have fragments, we have hints, we have inferences drawn from material evidence and filtered through the accounts of foreign observers. But we do not have the thing itself, the lived reality of Tartessian civilization, the experience of being Tartessian, the Tartessian understanding of what it meant to be part of the Tartessian world. Let that sink in. This is not science fiction. It is the normal condition of most human civilizations that have ever existed. The civilizations that left behind extensive written records, that produced the libraries and the archives and the literary traditions from which we reconstruct the past, are the exceptions, not the rule. The vast majority of human societies that have ever existed left behind no written records at all, or records so fragmentary and so poorly preserved that they illuminate only narrow aspects of the cultures that produced them. The Tartessians had writing. They used it, but they used it primarily for short funerary inscriptions, and the perishable materials on which they may have written longer texts, wood, leather, wax, cloth, have not survived the centuries. The result is a civilization that is archaeologically visible but textually silent, present in the material record but absent from the literary record, except through the distorting lens of foreign observers who described what they saw from the outside, without understanding what it meant from the inside. The Tartessian case also reveals something important about the politics of historical memory, and the way in which access to the written word determines which civilizations are remembered and which are forgotten. The Greeks wrote about Tartessos because they traded with it, because its wealth was impressive, and because the stories of its king's extraordinary longevity and generosity made good material for the kinds of narratives that Greek historians and geographers liked to tell. But the Greeks wrote about Tartessos from a Greek perspective, for Greek audiences, using Greek categories of thought. They did not attempt to understand Tartessian civilization on its own terms, to learn the Tartessian language, to record Tartessian traditions, or to preserve Tartessians' self-understanding. They treated Tartessos as a source of interesting stories and valuable metals, not as a civilization worthy of study in its own right. And when Tartessos ceased to be a useful trading partner, the Greeks stopped writing about it, and the civilization that had been recorded only in Greek terms disappeared from the Greek record, leaving behind nothing but the fragments that survive in the works of Herodotus, Strabo, and a handful of other authors. The Phoenicians, who had far more extensive and far more sustained contact with the Tartessians than the Greeks ever did, left even less in the way of literary testimony. The Phoenicians were prodigious merchants, but, by the evidence of what has survived, relatively modest literary producers. The great Phoenician libraries that are mentioned in ancient sources have not survived, and the Phoenician perspective on the Western Mediterranean, the Phoenician understanding of the peoples and the cultures they encountered during their centuries of commercial activity in the region, is almost entirely lost. We know that the Phoenicians established colonies on the coast of southwestern Spain. We know that they traded with the indigenous peoples of the interior. We know that the interaction between Phoenicians and Tartessians produced the cultural synthesis that we call the Tartessian civilization. But we do not have the Phoenician account of this interaction, the Phoenician understanding of who the Tartessians were and what they meant in the larger scheme of Phoenician commercial strategy. That account, if it ever existed in written form, has been lost along with the rest of the Phoenician literary heritage. The loss of the Phoenician literary tradition is itself one of the great intellectual catastrophes of the ancient world, and its consequences for our understanding of Tartessos cannot be overstated. The Phoenicians maintained commercial relationships with the peoples of southwestern Iberia for at least 3 centuries. During that time, they must have accumulated a body of knowledge about the Tartessian world that would be invaluable to modern scholars. Knowledge about Tartessian political structures, religious practices, social customs, language, and history. If even a fraction of that knowledge had been preserved in written form, our understanding of Tartessos would be incomparably richer than it is. But the Phoenicians wrote on papyrus, a material that survives well in the dry climate of Egypt, but that deteriorates rapidly in the damper conditions of the Levant and the Western Mediterranean. The Phoenician archives, the records of centuries of commercial activity across the Mediterranean, have vanished almost entirely, taking with them the Phoenician perspective on every culture the Phoenicians encountered, including the Tartessians. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the relationship between historical importance and historical memory. We tend to believe that the most important civilizations are the best remembered ones, that the societies that made the greatest contributions to human development are the ones that have left the deepest marks on the historical record. The Tartessian case directly contradicts this assumption. The Tartessians controlled some of the most valuable mineral resources in the ancient Mediterranean for at least 2 centuries. Their silver, their copper, their tin fueled the economies of the Phoenician trading network and, through it, the economies of the Eastern Mediterranean. The metals that the Tartessians extracted from the hills of southwestern Spain were used to make the tools, the weapons, the ornaments, and the currency that sustained civilizations from Tyre to Nineveh. The Tartessian contribution to the material infrastructure of the ancient Mediterranean world was enormous, and yet the Tartessians are among the least known, least studied, and least remembered civilizations of that world, precisely because they did not produce the written records that would have secured their place in the historical narrative. Let that sink in. The modern world tends to equate civilization with writing and literacy with historical significance. Societies that produced literature, philosophy, and history are regarded as civilized and important. Societies that did not are relegated to the category of prehistoric or pre-literate, implicitly second class, implicitly less worthy of attention and study. The Tartessians challenged this hierarchy. They were literate, after a fashion. They had a writing system. They used it. But they did not use it to produce the kinds of texts that modern scholars value most highly: the histories, the laws, the philosophical treatises, the literary works that constitute the canon of Western civilization. They used their script for short inscriptions, for marking tombs, for recording names and relationships, and perhaps brief religious formulae. And because they did not produce a literary canon, they have been treated as less important, less interesting, less civilized than their contemporaries in Greece and the Levant, even though their economic contribution to the ancient Mediterranean world was arguably greater than that of many societies that produced more extensive written records. The deeper truth is that the historical record is not a meritocracy. It does not preserve the most important civilizations and discard the least important. It preserves the civilizations that happen to produce durable written records in languages that happen to be transmitted through chains of copying and translation, that happen to survive the accidents of time, fire, flood, conquest, and neglect. The Tartessians did not happen to produce such records, or, if they did, those records did not happen to survive. And so the Tartessians became a footnote in someone else's story, a brief mention in the works of Greek historians who were interested in Tartessos primarily as a source of amusing anecdotes and exotic wealth, not as a civilization worthy of sustained study and careful preservation. The archaeologist Joseph Tainter's framework for understanding the vulnerability of complex societies provides an illuminating lens through which to view the Tartessian case. Tainter argued that complex societies invest increasing amounts of energy and resources in maintaining their organizational structures, and that these investments eventually reach a point of diminishing returns, after which the costs of complexity exceed its benefits and simplification becomes the rational response. The Tartessian system, built on the extraction and export of mineral wealth through a network of trade relationships mediated by Phoenician merchants, was a complex system with significant vulnerabilities. It depended on continued demand for its products in the Eastern Mediterranean. It depended on the maintenance of the Phoenician trading network that served as its commercial infrastructure. It depended on the continued availability of the mineral resources that constituted its primary source of wealth. And it depended on the social and political structures that organized the extraction, processing, and transport of those resources. When the Phoenician trading network was disrupted by the fall of Tyre to the Babylonians in 573, before the Common Era, and by the subsequent rise of Carthaginian commercial dominance in the West, the Tartessian system lost a critical component. The demand for Tartessian metals did not disappear, but the mechanisms by which those metals reached their markets were transformed. And the Tartessian kingdom, which had been optimized for a particular set of commercial relationships, found itself unable to adapt to the new conditions. This is the pattern that Tainter identified in civilizational collapse after civilizational collapse. The pattern of a society that has invested so heavily in a particular configuration of complexity that it cannot reconfigure itself when circumstances change. The Hittites, who invested in a vast network of vassal states and diplomatic relationships, could not survive when that network was shattered by the Bronze Age collapse. The Maya, who invested in intensive agriculture and monumental construction supported by a dense population could not sustain those investments when drought reduced the agricultural surplus. The Western Roman Empire, which invested in a military establishment of enormous size and expense, could not maintain that establishment when the economic base that funded it contracted, and the Tartessians, who invested in a metallurgical economy dependent on long-distance trade relationships mediated by foreign merchants, could not maintain that economy when the mediating merchants disappeared or were replaced by competitors with different priorities and different partners. But the Tartessian case adds a dimension to Tainter's framework that the other examples do not. The ritual closing of buildings at Cancerano and Casas del Toruñuelo suggests that the Tartessian response to crisis was not merely a passive collapse, a helpless disintegration in the face of forces beyond human control. It was an active process, a deliberate and ritually mediated transition from one way of life to another. The Tartessians did not simply watch their civilization fall apart. They participated in its ending, sealing their sacred buildings, sacrificing their horses, burying their monuments, as though they were performing the funeral rites of their own culture. This active participation in the process of transformation, this willingness to acknowledge the death of the old order and to perform the rituals that marked its passing, suggests a society that was neither helpless nor hopeless, but that had reached a collective decision, however painful, that the world as they had known it was over, and that a new world, a different world, was beginning. The question of what that new world looked like, what the Tartessians became after they ceased to be Tartessians, brings us back to the Turdetanians, the people who inhabited the lower Guadalquivir Valley when the Romans arrived in the 3rd century before the Common Era. The Roman geographer Strabo described the Turdetanians as the most civilized of all the Iberian peoples, noting that they possessed written laws that they claimed were 6,000 years old, a boast that is almost certainly exaggerated, but that suggests a society with a deep sense of its own antiquity and a strong tradition of legal and cultural continuity. Strabo also noted that the Turdetanians spoke a language that was distinct from that of their neighbours, a detail that is consistent with the survival of the Tartessian language, or a descendant of it, in the lower Guadalquivir Valley, well into the Roman period. If the Turdetanians were indeed the descendants of the Tartessians, as most scholars believe, then Tartessian civilization did not end. It transformed. The kingdom became something else, something less centralized, less wealthy, less visible to the outside world, but still recognizably connected to the past from which it had emerged. The Tartessians did not die. They changed their name and their social organization, adapted to the new commercial and political realities of the Mediterranean world, and continued to live on the same land, speak the same language, and maintain at least some of the same cultural traditions for another 3 or 4 centuries, until they too were absorbed, this time by the Romans, and their identity was dissolved into the vast homogenizing embrace of Roman provincial culture. The parallel with the Etruscans is impossible to ignore. Like the Etruscans, the Tartessians were absorbed by a more powerful neighbour. Like the Etruscans, they contributed their knowledge, their techniques, and their resources to the expanding civilization that consumed them. Like the Etruscans, their identity was dissolved into a larger whole, their name forgotten, their story told only in the words of others. And like the Etruscans, they remain, after 2.5 millennia, a civilization that we can see but cannot hear, whose material remains speak to us across the centuries, while their own words remain silent. But the Tartessian case carries an additional burden that the Etruscan case does not. The Etruscans, at least, have been partially recovered. Their tombs have been excavated, their art has been studied, their inscriptions have been analysed, their contribution to Roman civilization has been documented, however belatedly, by generations of dedicated scholars. The Etruscans remain enigmatic, but they are no longer invisible. They have been given, if not their own voice, at least a place in the narrative from which they were once excluded. The Tartessians have not yet reached even this level of recognition. They remain on the margins of scholarly attention, known primarily to specialists in Iberian archaeology. mentioned only in passing in general histories of the ancient Mediterranean, and entirely absent from the popular understanding of the ancient world. The average educated person has heard of the Etruscans. Almost no one outside of Spain and Portugal has heard of the Tartessians. And yet the Tartessicians controlled some of the most valuable mineral resources in the ancient Mediterranean for centuries, sustained a civilization of considerable wealth and sophistication, and played a crucial role in the economic life of the ancient world. Their obscurity is not a reflection of their importance. It is a reflection of the biases and the limitations of the sources on which our knowledge of the ancient world depends. There is a deeper lesson in this obscurity, a lesson about the nature of historical justice and the responsibility that the present owes to the past. The Tartessians did not choose to be forgotten. They did not choose to have their story told only in the words of foreigners who understood fragments of what they saw. They did not choose to have their buildings buried under meters of silt, their inscriptions scattered across museums in half a dozen countries, their language reduced to a puzzle that may never be solved. These things happened to them as they have happened to countless other civilizations throughout history, because the forces that destroy memory, the forces of time, of geological change, of cultural absorption, of the politics of narrative construction, are stronger and more relentless than the forces that preserve it. The Tartessians deserve to be remembered not because they were perfect, not because they were uniquely important, not because their civilization was greater than others, but because they were human, because they lived and worked and loved and suffered and created and died, and because the fact of their existence demands a response from those of us who have the privilege of knowing about it. The modern scholarship on Tartessos is, in its own quiet way, an act of resistance against forgetting. Every excavation report, every analysis of a Tartessian inscription, every chemical study of Tartessian metalwork, every attempt to reconstruct the economic networks, or the social structures, or the religious practices of the Tartessian world is an effort to push back against the silence that has swallowed this civilization for 25 centuries. The effort is incomplete. It will always be incomplete. The evidence is too fragmentary, the gaps too wide, the obstacles too formidable for a complete recovery to be possible. But the effort itself has value, a value that transcends the specific questions it addresses, because it affirms the principle that every human civilization deserves to be studied, understood, and remembered, regardless of whether it left behind the kinds of evidence that make the task easy. And the effort continues. New sites are being discovered, new techniques are being applied, new questions are being asked. The development of ancient DNA analysis has opened the possibility of studying the population history of the Tartessian zone at the genetic level, tracing the movements and the interrelationships of the peoples who inhabited southwestern Iberia during the first millennium before the Common Era. The application of isotope analysis to human remains and to animal bones from Tartessian sites is beginning to reveal patterns of diet, mobility, and animal husbandry that were invisible to earlier generations of scholars. Remote sensing technologies, including drone-mounted LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar, are being deployed across the landscape of the lower Guadalquivir, searching for the buried traces of structures that conventional archaeology cannot reach. The search for Tartessos is not over. It is entering a new phase, armed with tools and methods that Schulten could not have imagined, driven by questions that earlier scholars did not think to ask, and guided by a commitment to recovering the voices of the voiceless. That is the deepest and most admirable impulse of the archaeological enterprise. What does the Tartessian story mean for our understanding of the ancient world, and what does it mean for our understanding of ourselves? The question is not rhetorical, and it deserves more than a cursory answer, because the implications of the Tartessian case extend far beyond the specific details of southwestern Spanish archaeology, and touch on fundamental questions about how we construct our knowledge of the past, what we value in that knowledge, and what we lose when the sources on which our knowledge depends are incomplete, biased, or absent. The first and most obvious implication is that the ancient Mediterranean world was far more complex, far more interconnected, and far more culturally diverse than the traditional narrative of Western civilization suggests. The standard story of the ancient Mediterranean, the story taught in schools and told in popular histories, focuses on a handful of civilizations, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, that have left behind extensive written records and monumental architectural remains. These civilizations are treated as the main characters of the ancient story, the protagonists around whom the narrative revolves. Other civilizations, the Phoenicians, the Etruscans, the Carthaginians, the Iberians, the Celts, the Scythians, and countless others, are treated as supporting characters, mentioned only insofar as they interact with the main characters and otherwise ignored. The Tartessians do not even rise to the level of supporting character. They are extras, barely mentioned, quickly forgotten, their contribution to the ancient world acknowledged only in the footnotes of specialized scholarly publications. This hierarchy of historical attention is not based on the actual importance of the civilizations in question. It is based on the accident of textual survival. The civilizations that produced the most extensive and the most durable written records are the civilizations that dominate the narrative, regardless of their actual importance in the economic, political, and cultural life of the ancient world. The Tartessians contributed enormous quantities of silver, copper, and tin to the Mediterranean economy for at least 2 centuries. Without those metals, the Phoenician trading network would have had significantly less to trade, and the economies of the eastern Mediterranean would have been significantly poorer. But because the Tartessians did not produce extensive written records, their contribution has been marginalized, treated as a minor detail in a story that is really about other people. The second implication concerns the fragility of cultural memory. The Tartessians had a writing system. They used it, but their writing did not survive in sufficient quantity or quality to preserve their story for posterity. The materials on which they wrote were perishable. The language in which they wrote has not been fully deciphered. The texts that do survive are short, formulaic, and limited in their content. The result is a civilization that is literally voiceless, unable to speak for itself across the centuries, dependent for its representation on the accounts of others, who understood only fragments of what they saw. This voicelessness is not unique to the Tartessians. It is the condition of the vast majority of human societies that have ever existed, but it is particularly poignant in the Tartessian case, because the Tartessians clearly possessed the means to speak. They had writing, they used it, but those means were not sufficient to preserve their voice against the erosive forces of time and chance. The third implication is philosophical, and it touches on the relationships between knowledge and humility. The Tartessian case reminds us that our knowledge of the past is not comprehensive. It is selective, partial, and shaped by biases that are built into the very sources on which it depends. We know a great deal about certain aspects of certain civilization that happen to produce certain kinds of records in certain kinds of materials, that happen to survive certain kinds of destructive forces over certain periods of time. We know almost nothing about many other aspects of many other civilizations that were equally real, equally complex, equally worthy of study, but that did not happen to leave behind the kinds of evidence that our methods are designed to recover. The Tartessians are a reminder that the past is vastly larger and vastly more diverse than the surviving record suggests, and that the portion of the past that we can access through our sources is a tiny unrepresentative sample of the human experience as a whole. A fourth implication concerns the moral dimension of archaeological preservation. The sites of the Tartessian zone are under constant threat from development, from agricultural activity, from road construction, from urban expansion, and from illegal treasure hunting. Every Tartessian site that is destroyed without proper excavation is a page torn from a book that was already missing most of its pages, a further narrowing of the already narrow window through which we can glimpse the Tartessian world. The preservation of archaeological sites is not merely a matter of cultural heritage policy. It is a matter of justice, a recognition that the peoples of the past, including peoples like the Tartessians, whose names and stories have been largely forgotten, deserve to have their material remains treated with the same respect and the same care that we would want for our own. The destruction of an unexcavated Tartessian site is the destruction of evidence that can never be replaced, the permanent closure of a door that might have opened onto new understanding. The Tartessian case also carries implications for how we think about the role of natural resources in the rise and fall of civilizations. The Tartessians rose to prominence because they controlled access to extraordinarily valuable mineral deposits, and they maintained their prominence as long as the demand for those minerals and the commercial networks that distributed them remained intact. When those networks were disrupted by the fall of Tyre, by the rise of Carthage, by changes in the patterns of Mediterranean trade, the Tartessian system lost its economic foundation and could not sustain the level of wealth, complexity, and external engagement that had characterized its peak. The parallel with modern resource-dependent economies is uncomfortable but instructive. Nations and regions that depend on the extraction and export of a single category of natural resource, whether it is oil, minerals, timber, or agricultural products, are vulnerable to the same kind of disruption that undermined the Tartessian economy. When the resource is depleted, when the price falls, when alternative sources are developed, when the commercial networks that distribute the resource are disrupted, the entire economic structure that depends on that resource is threatened. The Tartessians discovered this truth 25 centuries ago, and the peoples and nations of the modern world have been rediscovering it at regular intervals ever since. The irony of the Tartessian case is that the mineral resources that made the civilization possible are still there. The copper mines of the Iberian Pyrite Belt are still being exploited today. The Rio Tinto mines, which the Tartessians may have worked more than 3,000 years ago, continued to produce copper and other metals throughout the Roman period, the medieval period, and into the modern era, when they became one of the most important mining operations in Europe, controlled for a time by a British mining company that extracted millions of tons of ore and shipped it across the world. The minerals that made Tartessos wealthy have generated wealth for every subsequent civilization that has occupied the region, from the Romans to the Moors to the modern Spanish state. But the civilization that first exploited those minerals on a large scale, the civilization that first attracted Mediterranean traders to the remote coast of southwestern Iberia, the civilization whose wealth was legendary even in the eyes of the Greeks, has been forgotten. The resources endure. The civilization that first understood their value does not. There is a lesson in that disparity, a lesson about the difference between the permanence of the earth and the impermanence of the societies that walk upon it. The question of whether the Tartessians possessed an understanding of their own vulnerability, whether they were aware that their prosperity depended on factors beyond their control, and that a disruption in those factors could bring their world to an end, is one that we cannot answer. We do not have access to their thoughts. We do not know what their priests said about the future, what their merchants worried about when the Phoenician ships were late, what their rulers planned for the contingency that the trade routes might shift or the mines might fail. We know only that when the crisis came, some among them chose to respond with ritual, with the deliberate closing of buildings and the sacrifice of horses, acts that suggest not panic but a measured, ceremonial acknowledgement that an era was ending. There is a dignity in that response, a gravity that transcends the specific circumstances that provoked it, and that speaks to something universal in the human experience of loss and change. There is a moment in the study of lost civilizations when the academic questions, the questions about dates and artifacts and trade routes and linguistic classification, give way to something more personal and more profound. It is the moment when you realize that the people whose lives you are studying were as real as you are, that they woke each morning to a world that was as vivid and as present to them as yours is to you, that they loved their children and feared their enemies and hoped for the future and mourned their dead with the same intensity and the same urgency that you bring to your own life. The Tartessians were real people. They lived in real houses, ate real food, spoke a real language, held real beliefs, and conducted real relationships with real people. They had names that we will never know, faces that we will never see, thoughts that we will never think, They existed as fully and as completely as any human being has ever existed, and then they were folded into the silence of the unremembered past, and now they are known to us only as shadows cast by the words of people who did not understand them, and who wrote about them for reasons that had nothing to do with preserving their memory. The Tartessians mined the silver from the hills of Huelva and sent it east across the Mediterranean to feed the appetites of empires. They smelted the copper and the tin and forged them into bronze in workshops that have left their mark on the landscape in slag heaps and furnace remains that are still visible after 25 centuries. They built buildings of stone and mud brick and timber, buildings that were used for worship and for governance and for the storage of the goods that made their kingdom wealthy. They buried their dead with care and with ceremony, placing in the graves the objects that the dead would need in whatever existence awaited them on the other side. They carved inscriptions in a script that we can read but not fully understand, leaving behind messages that hover at the edge of meaning, tantalizingly close to comprehension, but never quite crossing the threshold. They lived, and they died, and they were forgotten, and now they are being slowly, painstakingly, incompletely remembered by people who cannot speak their language and cannot fully comprehend their world. That incomplete remembering is the best we can do. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is what we have, and the act of trying, the commitment to recovering what can be recovered, to understanding what can be understood, to honouring the existence of people whose names are lost and whose stories are fragments, is an act of profound moral significance. It is an assertion that every human life matters, that every human civilization deserves to be remembered, that the accident of textual survival should not determine which peoples are studied and which are ignored. The Tartessians deserve better than silence. They deserve at least the imperfect, partial, uncertain remembrance that modern scholarship can provide. And so we come to the marshes of Doñana, the great wetland at the mouth of the Guadalquivir, where the river meets the Atlantic in a landscape of sand and silt and water and sky that has been changing for thousands of years, and that continues to change today. Somewhere beneath this landscape, beneath the reeds and the shallow lakes, and the shifting channels of water that weave through the marshes, like the threads of a story that has lost its plot, lies the answer to the question that has haunted scholars for more than a century. Where is Tartessos? Where is the city that the Greeks called the richest in the West? Where are the walls that King Arganthonios defended, the temples where the Tartessians worshipped, the warehouses where the silver was stored before it was loaded onto Phoenician ships and sent east across the Mediterranean to feed the appetites of empires? The marshes do not answer. They have been keeping their secret for 25 centuries, and they may keep it for 25 more, or forever. The silt that buried the ancient estuary is meters deep in places, and the techniques required to excavate beneath it are expensive, time-consuming, and limited in their reach. Remote sensing technologies, including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and geophysical survey, have identified numerous anomalies beneath the marshes that could represent weird structures. But confirming these anomalies requires physical excavation, and physical excavation in a protected wetland of international ecological significance is a delicate and politically fraught undertaking. The city of Tartessos may lie beneath the marshes of Doñana, waiting to be found by a future generation of archaeologists, equipped with better tools and blessed with better luck. Or it may lie elsewhere, beneath a modern town, beneath a farmer's field, beneath a stretch of coast that has been reshaped by centuries of erosion and sedimentation. Or it may never have existed as a single city at all, the name Tartessos referring to a region, a culture, a trading zone, rather than to a specific urban centre, with walls and gates and a palace on a hill. The uncertainty is the point. The uncertainty is the message. The Tartessian case teaches us that the past is not a book that can be opened and read at will. It is a landscape, vast and largely hidden, in which the visible features, the monuments, the inscriptions, the artifacts preserved in museums, represent only the tiniest fraction of what once existed. Most of the past is gone. Most of the past will never be recovered. The civilizations that we know, the ones that fill our textbooks and our documentaries and our museum galleries, are the survivors of a brutal process of selection in which the accident of material survival counts for more than the merit of human achievement. The Tartessians achieved something remarkable. They built a civilization that controlled some of the most valuable resources in the ancient Mediterranean. They developed a distinctive culture that synthesized indigenous traditions with Phoenician and Greek influences. They created works of art, the gold of El Carambolo, the painted pottery of the Guadalquivir, the bronze sculptures found at sites across the Tartessian zone that testify to a creative spirit of genuine power and originality. And then they disappeared, and the silence that followed their disappearance has lasted longer than their civilization itself. The gold of El Carambolo sits in a museum in Seville, behind glass, under lights, protected by alarms and guards and climate control systems designed to preserve it for centuries to come. The gold is beautiful, it is heavy, it is real. It was made by human hands more than 25 centuries ago, hands that shaped the metal with tools and techniques that had been refined over generations, hands that belonged to a person whose name we do not know, whose face we cannot see, whose thoughts and beliefs and daily concerns are as lost to us as the city that the Greeks called the richest in the West. The gold endures because gold endures. It does not rust. It does not decay. It does not crumble into dust and blow away on the wind, as the mud brick walls and the wooden beams and the linen scrolls and the wax tablets and all the other perishable materials of the Tartessian world have crumbled and blown away. The gold is the last solid link between our world and the world of the Tartessians, the one unambiguous, undeniable, physically present piece of evidence that testifies to the reality and the richness of a civilization that has otherwise been reduced to fragments and shadows and the distant echoes of Greek voices describing something they never fully understood. The inscriptions in the southwestern script stand on their stone slabs in museums across Portugal and Spain, the characters carved with care by hands that knew what they were writing, even if we do not. The words they wrote are still there, visible, legible in the narrowest sense, pronounceable by any scholar who has learned the values of the signs. But the meanings hover just beyond our grasp, close enough to sense but too far to seize, a message transmitted across 25 centuries of silence, by a people who could not have imagined that the language they spoke every day, the language in which they prayed and argued and sang and cursed and whispered endearments to their children, would one day be incomprehensible to anyone alive. Languages do not know they are dying when they die. The last speaker of a language does not stand on a stage and deliver a farewell address. The language simply ceases to be spoken, quietly, without ceremony, without notice, and the world it described, the world it made visible through the unique patterns of its grammar and the unique associations of its vocabulary, ceases to exist along with it. The Tartessian language is dead in this quiet and unceremonious way, and nothing can bring it back. We do not know where Tartessos lies. We do not know what finally ended it. We do not know the names of its people, the content of their prayers, the subjects of their stories, the melodies of their songs. We do not know whether they were Celtic or pre-Indo-European or something else entirely, something that our linguistic categories cannot capture. We do not know whether they had a king named Arganthonios who lived for 120 years, or whether that figure is a Greek embellishment wrapped around a grain of historical truth that we cannot extract. We do not know what they wrote on the materials that did not survive, whether they had histories and laws and poems and accounts of their dealings with the Phoenicians and the Greeks, or whether their literacy was limited to the short inscriptions that are all we have. We know almost nothing about them, and what we know is filtered through the words of others, shaped by the interests of others, limited by the understanding of others. We see the Tartessians not as they saw themselves, but as others saw them, and the gap between those two views is an ocean that no amount of scholarship can fully cross. Perhaps one day, a bulldozer cutting a foundation trench in some quiet Andalusian town will break through into a buried chamber, and the chamber will contain the tablets, the scrolls, the records that the Tartessians must have kept, the records that would give us their voice, their story, their side of the narrative that has so far been told only by others. Perhaps one day Satellite imagery or ground-penetrating radar will reveal the outlines of a buried city beneath the marshes of Doñana, the walls and streets and buildings of the capital that the Greeks described, but that no modern archaeologist has ever seen. Perhaps one day a bilingual inscription will be found, a text in Tartessian and Phoenician or Tartessian and Greek, that will give scholars the key they need to unlock the Tartessian language and read the inscriptions that have been waiting in silence for 25 centuries. Perhaps. But perhaps not. Perhaps the marshes will keep their secret. Perhaps the city will never be found. Perhaps the language will never be fully understood. Perhaps the Tartessians will remain forever what they are now. A civilization glimpsed through fragments, a kingdom known through rumors, a people remembered not in their own words, but in the words of strangers. The sun sets over the marshes of Doñana, and the light turns gold, the same gold that Tartessians pulled from the earth and hammered into pictorials and bracelets and necklaces that would outlast their civilization by millennia. The birds rise from the reeds in great clouds, spiraling against the evening sky, and the water catches the last light and holds it for a moment before darkness comes. Somewhere beneath this landscape, beneath the silt and the sand and the slow accumulation of centuries, there is a story that has never been told, a story of a people who mined the silver and smelted the bronze and built a kingdom on the banks of a river that has long since changed its course, a story of a people who were wealthy enough to attract the envy of the Greeks and powerful enough to command the attention of the Phoenicians, a story that was swallowed by the silence that consumes all things and that even now, after 25 centuries, has not yielded its full secret to anyone. The marshes hold their silence, and the gold gleams in its case. And somewhere in the gap between the silence and the gold, the Tartessians exist, neither fully remembered nor fully forgotten, waiting in the space between history and legend for someone to find them, to name them, to tell their story in their own words, which is the one thing that can never be done. The gap between the gold and the silence is the space where Tartessos lives, and it is the space where it will remain, beautiful and mute, for as long as anyone remembers to look.